Good morning all. Welcome to High Street Conversations for the 17th of November. And today we are talking about Austerity 2.0. And the reason is fairly clear. It is a big day, a day in which the UK is braced for probably the most important fiscal event since the emergency budget of June 2010. And I think we've used that term fiscal event quite a bit recently. The recent mini budget was a fiscal event because it wasn't really a budget. Apparently today's autumn statement is not a budget either. I'm not sure why. I don't know what the difference is. I don't know if it's just semantics, but casting our mind back to June 2010 when we had the emergency budget, Conservative Lib Dem coalition coming into Downing Street in the context of a debt crisis for the UK. A debt crisis started in Wall Street and then spread globally. And in response, the then Chancellor George Osborne announced cuts to public spending in order to bring the UK's finances into balance. The aim was to achieve a balanced budget within 5 years, and that included 80% spending cuts and 20% tax rises. Within that plan, it was identified that departmental spending had to be reduced by about 17 billion over those 5 years, with unprotected departments facing an average real cut of around 25% over 4 years. So that's pretty hefty. Today, we're looking at something not too dissimilar. Balance is probably a little bit more equal between spending cuts and tax rises. So we expect today that we will see 35 billion in spending cuts and 20 billion in tax rises, according to the BBC. So our first question for today is, why are we back here again? Why did the changes in finance back then not really work? So firstly, let's start off with the issue of the pandemic. Probably one of the biggest challenges we've seen to the UK financially. It probably doesn't get mentioned enough. So the pandemic has cost us nearly £400 billion. Much of that, the biggest chunk of that, according to the National Audit Office, actually went on things we campaigned for. 147 billion in terms of support for businesses. So that would have been things like Eat Out to Help Out. I assume the furlough scheme falls under support for businesses rather than support for individuals as well. So that is important to remember. Remember business rates relief, which is actually still in place, and other schemes as well. So 376 billion in total. And we are counting the cost of that. The pandemic put an upward pressure on government spending and downward pressure on government income. And also new strains of the virus extended the need for support, probably a lot longer than the government originally anticipated when it was outlining plans for lockdown in March 2020. By the end of the last financial year, so by March 2022, the Office for National Statistics says that UK public sector net debt stood at 2.4 trillion, which is 99.6% of GDP. That is absolutely massive. So that's a huge chunk of debt. The vaccine offered hope that we could roll back support and take the pressure off public finances. But unfortunately, the need for support has continued beyond restrictions. And that's because now we have a cost of living crisis, in which real terms wages have fallen, living standards have fallen, meaning huge pressure now on the government to significantly increase public sector pay, maintain pensions triple lock, and also increase benefits. And it's at this point when you start to look back at the emergency budget in June 2010, remembering that there were pressures on public sector pay back then. And one of the reasons why we're struggling with industrial action now is because ultimately what a lot of public sector workers say is that they have suffered real terms cuts to pay for over a decade now. And so recent inflationary pressures is just too much to bear. And then there's the challenges with energy. So the UK government has had to commit tens of billions in terms of energy support for households and businesses amid a cost of living crisis. So we're not exactly sure how much this is going to cost the government, but we do know it is probably in the realm of tens of billions. We expect that it is one of the things where we will get more clarity on today. So why do we even have a cost of living crisis now? Well, we know inflation has emerged partly because of the Russian invasion of Ukraine, and partly because of demand spiking as we came out of COVID restrictions, and we had a misalignment of demand and supply as supply chains had to scale back up. However, there's much more happening out there, and this is where things start to get complicated. This is where we start to get into the nuts and bolts of the challenges we have right now here today, and things which need to be discussed to understand their full impact. So just bear with me 1 second. Yes, everybody's favorite topic. I would hope that I could get away without having to speak about it anymore. But unfortunately, it does need to be discussed, and that is the UK's withdrawal from the EU, which unfortunately continues to haunt some parts of the private sector. Brexit has had a number of impacts, which, because it's probably not discussed by politicians enough, those issues remain unresolved, and so it continues to plague the operation of businesses. Take trade, for example, between the UK and the EU. It is much harder. According to the Economic and Social Research Institute, trade is around 16% lower with the EU than it was before our exit from the single market. And it's having a real tangible impact on plenty of businesses that did used to once trade quite significantly with the EU. Take the case of Simon Spurrell, who has a cheese business, is actually not too far away from me. So Macclesfield based, became famous when he had an absolute meltdown over Macclesfield's decision to vote to leave the EU because of the impact he knew it would have on his business. It has got to the stage where he has given up. He says in literally the past couple of days this week, he can no longer make it viable. And so he is having to sell his business because he cannot make it work anymore, because trade has been so fundamentally damaged with the EU. Even trade within the UK is much harder. So the Northern Ireland Protocol is a challenge, especially for the retail sector. M&S recently coming out and saying the protocol remains a risk to its business and a challenge for the supply chain. And it also causes obviously political instability in Northern Ireland, as we are without an executive at the moment. This week, we've heard that London has lost its position as the most valuable European stock market, being overtaken by Paris, which becomes the new financial powerhouse of Europe. Again, Brexit is believed to be the challenge. And one of the massive changes we've seen as a result of our vote to leave the EU is the fluctuation of the currency, mainly in a downward trajectory. It was predicted that it would happen. And there are a number of things which have impacted the pound in relation to the dollar and euros over the years. Probably a bigger impact was actually the financial crash back in 2008, as you can see there, where there is a significant drop. But there is also clearly a drop around about 2016, is probably the second big drop at the point in which we vote to leave the European Union. And that has not really recovered since. And in the past few weeks, as we know, has gone down further still. We've got a labour shortage. Again, Brexit partly to blame for this, for the loss of EU workers. Some sectors being blamed, some sectors more exposed than others. Hospitality and leisure sectors tended to have a disproportionate amount of EU workers within them. So they are sectors particularly struggling as a result. And all in all, the Office for Budget Responsibility, their name will come up again and again throughout this presentation. They estimate that UK GDP is down by 4% as a result of Brexit alone. They say that COVID itself extends that loss by a further 2%, but Brexit is responsible for 4% loss of GDP. So economically, things have changed for us. Our economy has shrunk as a result. However, it's not something which is necessarily widely discussed in terms of economic strategy for the UK, which becomes a challenge. It's a bit like, trying to think of an analogy here, it's like the crew on the Titanic trying to figure out why the ship is taking on water and what to do next without discussing the iceberg it's just passed. And that, I think, for us is a real challenge, and I will come onto that in more detail. You then have some of the legacy of austerity, and how that can be a challenge when it comes to growing your economy. So let's start. We know we've got labour shortages. Now there's lots of issues which austerity may have caused in terms of economic growth, not least the fact that the majority of cuts within local government have actually fallen on sectors such as economic development and planning, the things which are non-statutory, which are a problem certainly for us in managing town centres, but there's other things as well. So these are stats which recently came to me from the Health Foundation. Of the 3.8 million, these are relatively young people, 50 to 69-year-olds, who are people that actually want to work, who want to be economically active, but are actually a large portion of them inactive. 1.7 million of them report that they are inactive because of ill health. Long COVID, partly a problem, but a big emerging problem is this long NHS waiting list for treatment, which means there's a number of people who would be more than happy to help out in terms of supporting businesses. And it's certainly happening in the hospitality sector, where they're looking at a older group of people coming in to take up available vacancies. But unfortunately, they're not able to due to health reasons. And that is becoming a real challenge. It is restricting a potential supply of labour which our businesses need. It's not just health services which are a problem. It's things like childcare as well. I'd never thought for a town centres meeting I'd be talking about NHS and childcare, but they all play, that they all make up part of this complex picture. According to this Telegraph article, childcare costs eat up more than a fifth of an average earning couple's income, which is the third highest of the OECD countries. And it's believed it's a reason why only 40% of women with a child under the age of 15 are actually in full-time work in the UK, which is far below the OECD average of 53%. So again, we've got people out there who probably wouldn't mind being able to work full-time, but can't because the public services to support them aren't necessarily there. Again, a restriction on economic growth. Also challenges around, obviously, as I've already mentioned, industrial action, which is having a very tangible impact already on certain sectors, on footfall, on spend. Rail strikes fairly recently, caused by real terms cuts to salaries, have reignited work from home and hampered footfall. And certainly I have to think twice if I want to travel anywhere at the moment by train. It is becoming a real challenge. And more recently, another problem emerged. And I think we know what this problem was. So recent government policy, rather than helping us to fix some of these problems as intended, probably made it worse. The mini budget, you talk about a country which is 2.4 trillion pounds in debt. The mini budget became the straw that broke the camel's back, but probably not for all the reasons some people understand it to be. And so to understand why we are where we are today and difficult choices need to be made today, we need to understand what exactly happened with that mini budget and what the fallout really was. So on the mini budget, 23rd of September, Kwasi Kwarteng, the new Chancellor, the new old Chancellor, announced a mini budget full of tax cuts to kickstart the economy, which was challenged with supply side problems. So when we say supply side, we're talking about business output, productivity, being able to produce things. Now, some of what was proposed may have been beneficial for the economy in the longer term, but because the tax cuts were so significant and come on top of a UK which is already challenged with so much debt, record levels of debt, and also just committed on top of that debt to significant energy support, which instead of being paid for wholly by a windfall tax, would be paid by the exchequer. If you're bringing in more tax cuts, then you absolutely have to justify how those tax cuts will relate to growth, how those tax cuts will turn the economy around and end up bringing in more tax revenue rather than net less. So you have to be able to make the figures stack up with a clear and coherent plan, which shows investors how you are going to make it work. The tax cuts needed to be justified. We need to see the workings to make sure it's a plan that can work. Instead, what we got in just a few short days, we got Tom Scholar, who was permanent secretary for the Treasury, respected by many, so it seems, being labelled as being part of the old orthodoxy. And I think he was sacked on Liz Truss's very first day as Prime Minister, so she could push through radical tax cuts. The independent analysis of the Office for Budget Responsibility was rejected by the Chancellor and left unpublished, and we found out fairly shortly after. We were told that the OBR just wouldn't be able to turn around an analysis in time. We actually found out a few days later that the OBR was ready to go with an analysis on the impact of the tax cuts. And the OBR plays an important role here. So the OBR was actually created by George Osborne during his emergency budget as providing an independent view as to what the impact of any of the government's fiscal policies will be to stop any challenges which may have occurred under the Labour government before. That's the OBR's very role. Their very role is to take things like the mini budget and say, right, this is going to be the impact on the UK's finances in the long term. And investors really value that. They really value that. So to reject their analysis was a big, big thing. On top of that, then there's also the issue of the Bank of England working at cross purposes with the Treasury. So whether it's the fact that the Bank of England is infuriated that Brexit is seldom mentioned as one of the challenges we have, whether it's the fact that the Bank of England's one and only task really is to keep inflation at a reasonable level, and all these tax cuts coming in actually have inflationary pressures at a time when inflation is already out of control, or if it's the management of government bonds, which did become a problem. On all these things, the Bank of England was clashing with the Treasury. So that was a challenge. And then even just within government itself, we had so many challenges. So we've talked about the challenges of the labour market and how it's restricting businesses in terms of their growth and doing what they're able to do. We had this crazy situation where the former Prime Minister, Liz Truss, is keen on more immigration because she sees that as one of the solutions to overcoming that issue. Whereas the Home Secretary, now still current Home Secretary, Suella Braverman, completely disagreed and had a policy to limiting immigration as much as possible. And the Home Office and number 10 Downing Street ultimately working at cross purposes as a result. Frankly, investors were probably watching this in absolute terror and thinking, there is no plan here. This is a mess. This is a leap of faith, which the government is asking us to take and invest in when we're already over £2 trillion in debt. And that's the problem. The problem didn't necessarily become just about the amounts of money. it became about having any trust in what the government was about to do. So you can do the maths all you like, you can do the sums, but ultimately, if investors don't trust what you are going to do with their money, they will pull their money out. And that's what happened in fairly swift action from investors. Pulled their money out of sterling and the pound's value dropped like a stone only minutes after the mini budget was announced. And that had all sorts of problems around inflation. Bank of England had to respond by saying it was going to increase interest rates and quickly, and it has. But by doing so, it's had a knock-on impact on people's living costs, on mortgages, on those who are renting from landlords who have mortgages. So whether you're a renter or a homeowner, you may well have already been exposed to sharp increases in terms of your housing costs. Massive shock in terms of government bonds. Government bonds sold off as quickly as investors could manage, which meant the cost of borrowing for the UK government shot through the roof. And there was what's called a dynamic run on pension funds, some of which went to the brink of insolvency and were probably hours away from collapsing. The Bank of England had to intervene again, buying up UK government debt just to steady the market. And it warned that volatility had become a material risk to the UK's financial stability in the wake of the mini budget. This intervention also prevented this intervention ultimately prevented the loss of pension funds, according to many. There was a really interesting article actually in the Financial Times by someone who I think remained anonymous, who said it was probably hours before some pension funds may have collapsed. And so the issue of trust is important, because when we start to talk about why small things like, say, tax cuts to high earners had such a big impact on the markets, when ultimately it's something fairly small and trivial in comparison to things like support for energy or COVID support, etc. And understanding why not just reversing that tax cut now will just settle everything, because it's no longer, like I say, just about the maths. It is about restoring trust. To restore order, we have had to have a clean sweep. Prime Minister Liz Truss, Chancellor Kwasi Kwarteng gone, replaced. So too has nearly all of their agenda: tax-free shopping, income tax cuts, 2-year energy freeze on households, almost all of it gone, scrapped. And it's the start of trying to rebuild trust in the UK as a safe bet for investment. Andrew Bailey just yesterday was talking about this. Yes, some of the immediate damage from the mini budget has now been repaired, but ultimately the damage, which is going to take much longer to repair, is the UK's reputation as a safe place to invest money. There's a long road to go in terms of that, and a lot to do in terms of rebuilding that so-called fiscal credibility. This is partly about a realignment to reflect the UK's position post-Brexit. Like I say, Brexit not mentioned probably enough anymore to be able to begin to address some of the challenges. And that is noted across the world. That is noted globally. The Atlantic magazine very recently saying how the UK became one of the poorest countries in Western Europe, outlining the challenges around Brexit and trade with the EU, with very few meaningful trade deals to actually replace that trade lost with the EU. And the Financial Times fairly recently going further during the Conservative leadership election, warning that post-Brexit, the UK cannot expect American levels of tax with European style of public services. The maths just don't add up for that anymore. There needs to be a massive change in terms of how we invest, what we invest in, what our taxes look like. And if anything, to repair the economic credibility, what Jeremy Hunt and Rishi Sunak believe they need to do is actually probably to go further was necessary previously in terms of bringing money into the coffers of the Treasury. And so it means some of the actions which will need to be taken today are probably more austere than what they would have needed to be just a few months ago, because we need to repair that economic credibility. So what's expected? So like I say, around 30 billion in terms of spending cuts, 24 billion in terms of tax rises. So that works out as a split of 55% of money found from spending cuts, 45% found from tax rises, and that's to plug what is believed to be a sort of financial gap of somewhere between 50 and 60 billion in the finances. Now the threshold for top rate taxpayers for high earners will actually be lowered to bring in more money. The BBC is expecting the health budget will be protected in real terms, but the energy price guarantee, so this is support for households in terms of energy, it will remain in place after the initial 6 months, but it will be set at a higher level, which means energy bills are set to rise in the near future. What are the things we don't know though? What are the things for our industry that are at risk? One of the things which Liz Truss wanted to bring in were investment zones, and certainly we're looking at how investment zones can be adapted to work for high streets to help build partnerships excuse me, and get things done. But one of the levers for making investment zones work is business rates cuts, and we don't know if the Treasury is going to be happy with that anymore, and also concerns around environmental impacts of investment zones outside of existing the existing built environment, so certainly in greenfield spaces. As a result, Michael Gove is reviewing investment zones. They could be at risk. We will find out soon whether they will be scrapped or not. The autumn statement, it is said, is reviewing all capital spending. So I'm thinking money for regeneration could be at risk, not least levelling up funding. So we will have to keep a keen eye on that and what this autumn statement means for the levelling up agenda. There's been lots of talk about needing to do something on business rates and having changes. Remember, I think we've got business rates relief pretty much expiring for most places in the UK at the end of this financial year. Not only will business rates come back in full without change, but also we have to remember that the inflation rate is 10.1%, which means the cost of business rates will probably go up as well than what they, in comparison to what they would have been. Vivian King, former CEO of Revo and chair of the Shopkeepers campaign, has published an article saying brace for austerity, why the autumn statement could be brutal for businesses, talking specifically around the challenges of business rates and an expectation that we aren't going to see a lot of support from the Treasury. So that's also something to watch out for. Today's announcement could have a significant impact on the future of town centre investment for both public and private sectors. So it'd be good today to talk about what your fears are, what challenges as you see them, what you would like ATCM to lobby on, depending on what the outcome is of the budget in literally just, we're talking about an hour away now, aren't we? And remember, all of this, the spending cuts, the tax rises, are all going to happen during what is already a cost of living crisis, and will continue to hammer consumer confidence. Probably one of the reasons why the Bank of England is projecting a 2-year recession, which will be the longest on record. And this hot on the heels of the news that inflation has gone up again, which I wasn't expecting it to go up so much. I was even hoping optimistically it might have peaked. Not the case. Inflation now up to 11.1%, up from 10.1% the month before. So it continues to erode living standards. So our first question for today is, how bad are things going to get on the high street with inflation rampant and so much damage being done to consumer confidence. What does that mean for our high street businesses? So it's at this point I want to bring in Andy Sumter from Centrematic to talk us through what some of the challenges are for the high street at the moment. Andy, do you want to come in? I think everybody's sick of listening to me.
No, a tough act to follow, actually. Some really interesting points. So that was awesome. Thank you. Can I share my screen? Let me see.
Yeah, she'll be able to say big green button at the bottom.
Can you see my screen now?
Yeah, perfect.
Perfect, excellent. So I just want to go through a few things. I don't know whether I'm going to be able to bring any positivity or happiness to add on to a fairly bleak report so far, but I'm going to just want to talk through the recovery trends. We kind of know the answer, but I'll go into a bit of the detail of is footfall back to normal yet? We did a shopper sentiment survey at the end of September, where we asked a lot of questions of UK consumers and their kind of what they were doing in anticipation preparation for Christmas. So I've got a couple of call outs from that. And I'm still not sure whether we've got positivity on the World Cup either. But I'm also going to mention in 3 days, I think it is, we kick off the World Cup, which is the first time ever it's been held in the winter. So what impact that might have on retail and the impact for retailers, really. So the first thing I'll explain the visual here. This is footfall over this year. This is compared to pre-pandemic levels. So this is versus 2019. And this is still entertaining, you know, what we've been calling 2019 as normal for some time. And I've got the major economies of Europe on here, but the UK is in green, and the UK has been fairly consistent, I guess, across this period. But I think one of the key things that us as a business are looking at now is really the relevance now. As OJ, you've been talking about, there's still an impact of COVID, but on the day-to-day for consumers, it kind of seems like old news, and really we're only really seeing an impact of COVID in China. So we're kind of moving away from 2019 comparisons to looking at kind of the traditional year-on-year data more so. And if we look at year-on-year comparisons, it's a little bit more difficult with the first half of the year, because particularly when we include the other European nations. Again, the UK has been consistent, but we had 200-300% year-on-year comparisons at the start of the year, because we were still comparing against times when we had restrictions. But for May, we've really started to kind of settle and be a little bit more consistent. But if I remove kind of January to May from the visual, so we can get a more kind of sensible scale, you can see we're now just comparing to post any of the restrictions, and you can see the UK is kind of slowly stabilizing down to a more normal comparison as we're comparing against times when we were post restrictions. And we're of course here comparing against post invasion of Ukraine as well. As OJ's mentioned, we've got a whole host of new challenges now affecting shoppers and shopping, and probably more paramount and front of mind is cost of living, energy prices, and of course still supply chain issues not fixed. But what we have, if we look at year on year, is kind of more comprehensible comparisons, where these give kind of some real context to store performance, and most of our clients are now looking at sort of next year, looking at year on year comparisons, but probably more looking at month on month and week on week monitoring, because things are changing so kind of quickly, really. So looking at kind of the latter part of the year, I have a visual on how purchasing behaviours have been changing. Now, this is pure UK data, but you can see the black line here is changing traffic, which has been coming down to a kind of a more normal, nearer to the sort of 0%, because we're not comparing against restricted times. But you've got average transaction has stayed pretty consistently up, which is the dotted yellow line, and as the sort of BRC KPMG sales tracker showed earlier this month, I think it was, a large part of that is inflationary pressures. You know, prices are going up, so maybe people aren't buying more, they're actually just paying more for what they were buying, and that of course has an impact on what we call sales per shopper. So that's the total sales divided by the total number of visitors, whether they transact or not. That's the blue line, and then finally the dotted purple line is conversion, the number of people who visit stores and then transact. And during COVID times, we saw that exceptionally high. It's taken a big step back, and it's now sort of coming back to closer to positive. Maybe, you know, during COVID times it was about being purposeful, because, you know, there were risks shopping, so people were kind of thinking about going out and thinking about shopping. Perhaps some of the impact now is people are going out, but they may be visiting more stores because they want to see find the right price, or they're being more considerate whether they need to make that transaction. So so far on all this data, we've only looked up to October, but of course we've got Black Friday just around the corner as well. So on the next slide, we look at the kind of impact that Black Friday can have, and on here again I've got the kind of 5 major European economies, and interestingly the UK typically has the least impact on our retail footfall, but it's still a significant uplift week on week, and this is the week on week uplift over the last 4 years. Of course 2020 was that exception, but a lot of retailers start to see from Black Friday being the kind of uplift as people start to do their start their seasonal or holiday shopping. So the key part for that is, for retailers, is inventory and labor have to be ready for that period of time. So just on the next couple of slides, you know, I've shown what's been happening with footfall in stores. We're going to have a look at what customers have been saying on the shopper sentiment survey we did. Now I've only pulled out three highlights from that, but I'll share with the group a link. You can download the full report. There are I think in excess of a dozen questions. We've asked in excess of 5,000 people across Europe, and there's 1,000 in the UK. And the first part is, when do you plan on starting your Christmas shopping? And the main call out here is the UK, again, as was reflected in the footfall numbers. Black Friday is maybe not as big a push for our shoppers as other parts of Europe. But then we kind of focus on Christmas, and of course other European nations go into January sales and kind of more religious events around that time of year, which fall into the following months. We also appear to have started shopping, or have suggested that we'll shop earlier. So our September, people who are saying they would start in September, was a higher proportion than anywhere else, which I thought was quite interesting. And no real surprises here, but we asked, how will your financial situation impact your Christmas budget? And this was consistent across Europe, but in the UK, in excess of 60% said they were going to be spending either slightly less or significantly less than previous years. And that's probably not a huge surprise there. So, you know, it's going to be a tough old fight for share of wallet. You know, it's going to be as hard as ever to, you know, meet customers' needs. So on the next slide, the last question that I'm sharing today is, what will be the most important thing to you shopping in store? Now, I probably should have said at the start, with all these consumer surveys, I think it's always important to understand there's sometimes a disparity between what consumers say and what they actually do. And, you know, as you can see on screen, the biggest thing that's most important to them is price. Consumers will pretty much always say price is the most important thing. That doesn't always come to fruition, but that has consistently been improving, and we've done the same survey and pretty much the same questions for the last I think 4 years, and it's been getting higher and higher each year. And the cyan and magenta for the colors, dots are just showing the range across Europe. So this is the aggregated all of Europe, but so the UK will sit within those 2 dots. Probably not a huge surprise to see that price is right up there as the most important. But we will see that over the coming months, I'm sure. And if I'm to desperately try and find something positive, if there's anything going to change the mood of the nation, we do of course have a World Cup also just around the corner. And as I said, this is the first time it's ever been held in winter. It's always a 4-yearly summer event, and usually it has a reasonable impact on retail business. You know, people go out and buy new TVs, they buy you know, food and drinks for their own events. It's obviously very good for hospitality. We can't shy away from the fact that there's a fair degree of controversy around this year for a whole host of reasons around why it's being hosted in Qatar. But if we just look at the last World Cup, which was in Russia in 2018, so this is comparing to the impact in summer. 2 nations that performed quite successfully, England through to the semi-finals. You can see by the Sweden game in the quarterfinals, which was on a Saturday, actually, it had a huge impact on football. You know, people decided they were going to stay at home and watch the game rather than go out to the shops. And on the right-hand side, you've got France, the eventual winners. Their quarterfinal and semi-final games had an impact, and of course their final had a big impact again on shopping. Now, how that is likely to transpose into a winter event, you know, it's not as nice to go outdoors and watch it in the winter. And there's a number of places which are talking about not showing it in kind of protest, and of course it's clashing. I think the final is on the 18th of December, so it sits smack bang in the middle of what should be the busiest time for retailers. How that might have an impact is really super guesswork, I have to say. At the moment, we saw with the women's Euros was great. There was certainly a really good feel factor for the country when the women's team went on to win, and no doubt there'll be a positive impact for the nation that eventually goes on to win. But how that will sit in and fit with the impact on retail is really quite an unknown, to be honest. So that's just a few points from me. As I say, I can share the link, but there's we've got the top busiest days which I didn't cover today, but we've got a forecast of what we're expecting the busiest days to be, and also the full results of that sentiment survey that I can share with you. But that was my piece, OJ.
Andy, that was great. Everyone, so questions, comments, whether it's about, we'll get onto fiscal policy in a second, because I know you're all desperate to talk about tax rises, spending cuts. It's our favorite topic, guys. Don't tell me I'm wrong. But first, Andy, I think you've covered quite a few things which I think are really interesting. So anybody else that has any questions or comments on Andy's piece as well, feel free to chip in, comments in the text box, or put your hands up. Chair's prerogative. I'm going to start. It's only really just occurred to me, Andy, do you think this is the case, that in terms of understanding the full impact of the cost of living crisis on high streets, it's actually pretty difficult, because ultimately we don't have a proper benchmark unless we go all the way back to 2019 because of the disruption of the pandemic. If we were to compare like for like with, say, last year, it's very difficult to make a meaningful comparison and exactly what the impact of the cost of living crisis is having at the moment.
Yeah, and I think that's why lots of the retailers we work with are taking 23 as a switchover, because you would then be doing year on 4 year comparisons, and if you put aside all the problems that retailers are facing in the minute, that aside, retail evolves, retail grows and changes in so many ways that comparing against 4 years ago is almost, so before 2019, we were looking at a few percentage points drop in footfall year on year, and it was a steady decline. And the talk at the time, and it just seemed like a different period, but it was like, this is the impact of the internet, and internet was going to destroy the high streets, and and it was small percentage points drops. And of course we went into 2020 and we had 80-100% drops in footfall because shops were closed, and it was like it was a crazy time. But now as we open back up, it's almost it's a pointless discussion to say, well, what will be, and I avoided it for nearly 3 years, saying new normal. What's new normal going to be? Is it going to be minus 10% from those days or not? Because it doesn't really matter. It's about how you're performing now in the moment. And I think lots of retailers are going to say, actually, 2022, we've had a consistent year pretty much without disruption from COVID, without mandated restrictions. So we've got a whole host of new challenges, but they're all different. The impact of the cost of living, the changes in energy bills, uncertainty from a new prime minister and then another new prime minister. There's so many factors going on that it's you kind of got to put a line on the sand and say, well, okay, let's just look at what we control. So I've almost forgot the question you started with, but I hope I've answered it in along the way.
Oh yeah, definitely. And I think thinking about it, I guess for 2023, we again have a very difficult year in terms of being able to compare against any benchmark, because ultimately 2022, you've got cost of living crisis. 2021 to 2020, you've got COVID. And you're absolutely right. I think if you're starting to go back 3-4 years, then all of a sudden the comparisons almost don't really feel meaningful, because so much changes anyway.
Yeah, and I think the other thing which is important to look at, the kind of the near term, is it isn't just about an impact on the high street. And there's historically been lots of kind of doom and gloom predicted for the high street, and people won't shop there anymore. But that's simply not been the case. And we know now that actually just before Russia invaded Ukraine, it looked like there was going to be some sort of stability. Definitely people were heading back into the shops, and we didn't really have chance to measure whether this was just we've got freedoms again, and we can shop again, and that kind of pent up demand, or whether that would continue. But the things affecting retail now aren't retail problems per se. The amount of disruption on online players, even Amazon that turns over ludicrous amounts of money, is laying off thousands of staff. When you've got an online player as big as Amazon, who people will say is going to destroy retail, is laying off staff, then things are bigger than problems with retail. I think that's so it's worth having some perspective as to these aren't retail problems; these are bigger problems than that. And in the long term, I'm sure things will come good. Retailers have a strong retail offering. People will still buy stuff, and it's, I don't want to be dismissive of how tough things could be, and of course increased costs, pressure on pricing, and labour are just three of the incredible difficulties that retailers face. But if you're a good, solid retailer, there's going to be light at the end of the tunnel. It's going to be a tough period in the short term, I think.
Yeah, it is. And do you think the new year becomes a real challenge for the retail sector, because things tend to be quiet throughout January, February anyway, and then start to pick up in Easter for most places? Does it feel like this particular January and February are going to be particularly hard work because you've got that cost of living crisis added on to the normal January blues?
I think we'll see in the coming months, and I'm not saying that to sidestep an answer, but the whole premise of Black Friday is it's the start of when businesses can go into the black, right? And this is such an important period for most retailers. And if people are holding back on their spending to the degree that they say they might, then that's going to really hurt a lot of retailers. Whether people think about holding off and then things look so bleak that then just think, I'm going to have a good Christmas, I'm going to spend on the kids, I'm going to spend on myself, we might have a different story. But I think these next couple of months are going to be essential as they always are, but maybe a little bit more important than prior years. And considering what's been happening over the last few years, that's quite a statement.
Yeah, and that's quite scary, because when you consider it as well, you're absolutely right in terms of there's a lot of businesses on the high street that use the golden quarter to actually make their profit. If we have a really sort of small c conservative Christmas when it comes to spending, and then you go into the leaner months of January and February, then what happens at the end of March? Obviously, we have the challenge of potentially losing support on energy, or that support on energy sort of being phased out. Business rates relief disappearing and going back to 100%. I guess there's the possibility that some businesses, if they haven't been able to build up their reserves after what's been a pretty difficult 3 years, the end of that first quarter could possibly be time to shut their
Make
door.
or break. Yeah, absolutely. No, I think that's a sad reality, but I think that's likely the case.
Yeah, and we don't want to be too grim, so let's talk about World Cup. I didn't realize the extent to which the World Cup can actually kill football. Hadn't occurred to me at all. So is it a case that World Cups hit football because everybody wants to watch the football, but spend generally tends to be up because people want their TVs, they want their beers or their drinks or their snacks at home? So is it a case of footfall down, spending up?
So the charts I showed are on the match days, and that is where the passionate football nations, yeah, they're staying at home to watch the big games, right? So that has a detrimental effect, and of course some people go out because they think, oh, it's going to be quiet because my country's in the quarterfinals or finals, but generally there's a dip on those days, whereas in a normal year people might save up or splash out on a TV purchase, obviously food and drink purchases, surround sound system or whatever it is, and of course merchandise and so on. I've just seen a point in the chat at kickoff times. It's so odd to have it in the middle of peak season. If people are feeling a squeeze, then I don't see many people buying a big TV as a family present so they can watch the football. Are those little boosts for retail might fall by the wayside. And there's a lot of controversy around the hosts that can of course have an impact on the kind of the excitement and the build up if it's been broadcast kind of almost apologetically. And I've seen I think it's Paris has joined a number of French cities that are refusing to broadcast it out in, put the big public screens out. Now, of course, those screens, as we saw during when we hosted the Olympics, a long time ago, but when we've had the Commonwealth Games on, that brings people into towns and cities. They see a little bit of the sports, and it's a nice kind of bringing together communities, right? If that is being dampened, that can kind of have an impact on society as well. I think, and I'm not going to get to express football views, but I think if England were to do well, or if Wales was to do well, you would see a lot of the other noise would kind of get forgotten about, and people would get swept along winning a World Cup after so long, or for Wales winning a World Cup for the first time, and the same with the rest of Europe. If a host nation does well, I think that will have a really good feel factor. But undoubtedly, it's a very odd time to have a World Cup in the middle of winter, running right up to Christmas.
Yeah, it is bizarre, and it'd be really interesting to see the impacts. And I do wonder if for the hospitality sector, actually, it couldn't, for the hospitality sector, it couldn't come at a better time, because ultimately I think the cost of living crisis, it means people have to tighten their belts. And one of the things which is going to be first to go is that discretionary spend. You need your groceries, you need to pay for your heating, you need to pay for your mortgage. Do you need that meal out? Do you need to go to the pub as often? Not necessarily. And I wonder if the World Cup might be the thing that helps hospitality pull through. So that's another interesting question, I guess.
Somebody's put a comment in the chat though, is kickoff times are a factor as well. I don't think our games are too bad, but like the recent rugby and cricket games that have been on, when they're on at a crazy time early in the day, that doesn't help hospitality, because it's only the hardened few who are going to be at the pub at 9 a.m. or whatever. I don't think Qatar obviously isn't quite as bad as that, but they'll be early. Am I right thinking they'll be early in the day for a lot of the games?
England's first game is at 10 o'clock in the morning.
Ooh.
Yeah, that's quite hardcore to be at the pub for 10 in the morning to see a football match in it. It's not the same kind of atmosphere, but
yeah, up for a challenge show, so I'll see if I can manage it. thinking of all the challenges we've got around labour shortages, I can imagine those early kickoffs aren't gonna help things much. Declan, can I ask you for your views on whether you think it helps or hinders the high street to have the World Cup?
Well, it's an unknown quantity, really, is it? As Andrew was saying, it's unprecedented. We've never had this before, really. It's a World Cup in winter just before Christmas. So yeah, who knows? But yeah, that's the point I was trying to make, really. Sitting the group games, I think I'm right in saying a lot of them are kicking off at 10 o'clock. And then the next set of games are at 4 o'clock, which isn't ideal for hospitality. I wouldn't have thought, in my initial thoughts. But again, as Andrew has said, as the tournament will progress, the bigger games will be scheduled more in line with what you'd expect, I think, certainly for the bigger audiences in Europe. So that might be a silver lining.
Yeah, that's it. Really interesting. I think what we're going to do. So there is a meeting scheduled for ATCM England on the 6th of December. What I am thinking about is making that a joint meeting for ATCM England and Welsh Network, and we can have a conversation on what stats, data, evidence we've got on the impact of the World Cup on High Street so far, for both England and Wales. I think that might be a useful meeting to have. And I'll just have to double check, actually, because 6th of December, our meetings normally start at 10 o'clock, so I'll make sure it doesn't clash with any big game, because I'll be honest, I've got no idea when the games are meant to be.
Sorry, I've just looked now. Sorry, England's game on Monday is at 1 o'clock.
Okay, that's fine then.
Yeah.
that will help. Or else I assume I'll probably have very low attendance for any meeting which of the English or Welsh network which clashes with a key World Cup game. So yeah, I think we'll have that conversation. I think that will be useful. And open question really to the group, to go back to the cost of living crisis in general and what we may have in store for the autumn statement. Is there anybody that thinks there is something specific they'd like to see from the autumn statement, something they think ATCM should be campaigning on, whether it's more funding for local authorities to do economic development, whether it's cuts to VAT or business rates for businesses, whatever it might be, whether it's a commitment to levelling up funding. Is there anybody with any thoughts? Speak now or forever hold your peace.
I'd say, yeah, infrastructure spending on it, or the threat of holding back on the infrastructure spending would be a big issue, really. Things like funds that have already been committed that might be decommitted would be, I think, an issue, really, in terms of obviously longer term planning for things like transport infrastructure.
Yeah, no, I agree, and I think what we need to get much better at in investment, because I think there's always been a difference between something from the government which is a cost and something which is an investment. And there's certain bits of infrastructure which supports town centres, whether it's broadband or transport, etc., which, if the investment is made, is beneficial in the long term in comparison to not spending the money. It will help generate the growth we actually need. So I would absolutely agree with that. And I think that is an important distinction to make, is working with policymakers to demonstrate that some things will actually support the mission of growth. Are there specific projects you'd have in mind, Declan?
No, the reason it's sort of uppermost in my mind at the moment is because we've for instance, there's been some money committed to improvements around in Bristol, the main train station, Bristol Temple Meads. But if that doesn't come to pass, then obviously that has huge knock-on effects for, for potentially for years to come, and just that the whole area might be adversely affected if that money is withdrawn when we're under the impression that it's committed.
Yeah.
So multiply that probably hundreds of times across the country. That doesn't really bear thinking about, I don't think.
Absolutely. I 100% agree with that. It'd be good to hear from others as well. Is there anybody from a bid that wants to jump in with anything they would like to see? Oh, Matthew from Harrogate, are you there? Is there anything you'd like to sort of chuck in?
Hi, Jake. Hi, Andrew.
How you doing?
I'm all right. Thank you. How are you?
I'm good, and glad to see you. You're with us, actually. It's really good to have you on the call.
Thank you. I think for me, kind of thinking outside of the box, OG, you'll be much more of an expert on this. I mean, probably remember the announcement probably around about 4 or 6 months ago. It was where the government had said they were going to give a lot more responsibility to bids and local authorities and community groups on the kind of control that they have with vacant units, and including the community in the high street, and bringing the NHS and those kind of things onto the high street to create that more community feel and allow the community to a little bit control their destiny a little bit more. And I feel if times are going to be hard, as we've heard from what we've chatted through today, but I feel if we get buy-in from more people in the community and businesses and local authority, that surely is only going to be a good thing. And I think if people feel separate from that, and they feel it's the government or the people who've talked about on this call that are making all the decisions for them when they disagree with it, I just feel like it's time maybe for a little bit of the reins to be handed more locally, so that the people that are going to support the businesses and support the community can actually have a bit more of a say and more of an impact on what's happening in their town or city. Agreed.
I don't think there's anything in that statement which is controversial, if anything. So this is one of the things I'd actually like to see. And I don't know if the term has sort of been undermined possibly by the approach of the previous administration, but it's what I'd like to see investment zones actually used for. And that is, if you want to give incentives to landlords in a town centre, in order for them to get those incentives, whether they'd be tax breaks in the forms of business rates or planning incentives, then they'd have to all work together. So you'd end fragmented property ownership, but they'd also have to have businesses, local government, and especially the community all working together to identify how they can take the town centre forward in collaboration, a bit like the town boards created for town deals. So to really sort of scale up partnerships in urban centres, I'd really like to see something like that. Having the community more involved in decision making in the right way, I think would be a benefit. So no, I agree. Any more comments or questions before we go? I am conscious that we're just 15 minutes away from the Chancellor taking the stage, so we can finally see what's going to be announced. So just before I let you all go, I do have just something else to share with you. So firstly, to say that part 2 of this event, where we will actually go through the details of what is in the autumn statement today, and we'll go through it in depth. That will take place on the 1st of December. So 1st of December, we will have an in-depth review of everything announced in the autumn budget, what ATCM's response should be, what it means for UK town centres going forward. In the meantime, I just wanted to bring to everyone's attention the Let's Celebrate Towns campaign, which is being hosted by Visa. So Visa have launched this campaign, which is open to councils, business improvement districts, other forms of town centre partnerships, where you can win up to 20k for any projects you are working on related to business environment, infrastructure, people and skills, sustainability and economic prosperity. So I think it's 20k for winners and 10k for those termed as rising stars in these categories. And it looks like it's a fairly simple application process as well. So any projects you're working on or have done related to these core categories, send in an application. You won't, there's no loss in sending in an application. Get something in. We know that all of our members are doing some fantastic work, and will probably score very highly in, if not one, but a number of these categories. So where you need to go to is, and I might also just put this in the chat box for you all, www.visa.co.uk/campaign/talk-of-the-town. So put that in and it will take you to the right page. Let me see if I can just put that into the chat box for you. So yeah, it's definitely worthwhile. Visa are looking forward to you guys putting in as many applications as you can. We've spoken to them and they're keen for you to get on board. And during a time where money is a bit tight for everyone, I think a nice little 10k or 20k or whatever it might be to support existing projects certainly wouldn't go amiss. That's it from me, guys. We're 13 minutes away, so go get yourself a cuppa and jump in to that autumn statement. I know you're all looking forward to, because you can't get enough fiscal policy, and we'll do this all again on the 1st of December when we pick through the bones. So thanks a lot, guys. Hope to see you again soon, and thanks a lot, Andy, for your contribution.